Would you please check your ideas and opinions at the door? All your philosophical and religious views, all your logic, because I say check it at the door advisedly because you can pick it up again when you go out if you feel unsafe without it. I'm not trying to argue you out of your opinions and views. I'm merely suggesting that for the sake of an experiment, you temporarily suspend them.
Hello and welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, an exploration of all things philosophical, alchemical, and esoteric, from the psycho-spiritual to the material-chemical nature of the all. Join me and my guests as we inquire into the liminality of mind and matter, and tend to the fertile soils of awareness and perception while facilitating an expanded consciousness from the individual to the collective. If you enjoy the show and find it of value, consider supporting and becoming a patron via the Patreon at patreon.com/philosophicalminds. A small contribution makes a big difference and definitely makes it easier for me to continue the show, although I will always do my best to keep it flowing regardless. Thank you all, and let's get into it. All right, I am joined this evening with a former counterintelligence specialist for the FBI, counterintelligence OSI agent, Office of Special Investigations, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, former counterterrorism consultant, Walter Bosley. Walter is an author and publisher, licensed private investigator as well. He has been on the Gaia network as well as the History Channel, and he's just an extremely interesting and well-researched individual. Lots of interesting stuff in a lot of unique areas, some of which we'll be going into tonight. But with that being said, Walter, thank you so much for doing this. I'm very excited to talk with you. And if there's anything additionally that you'd like to add about yourself or your background, go ahead and feel free for the listeners.
No, it's great to be here. I think you covered it all. I was on a Travel Channel show once too, National Park Mysteries.
Awesome. All right. Well, there's so much that we can get into. Before we get into a lot of your personal research and investigations, I want to ask you, because I'm always curious where people stand and you know what they have to say, that people that have actual experience in these sort of areas and certain agencies. And I've interviewed a few different people that have been involved with different like intelligence agencies and whatnot. And it seems like all things, there's a mix in terms of like culture and whatnot. And there's a lot of suspicion and mystery that kind of runs parallel with some of the community of folks that are interested in the sort of things that we'll be talking about tonight, or like, the paranormal or parapolitical nature of the things in society. And so like in terms of your involvement with the FBI, there's obviously popular awareness these days about like historical involvement with things like where they would say, questionable activities, like scenarios with anti-war movement and in the past where, people were kind of almost being like instigated into protests and stuff like this that we hear these days. And I don't know, there's a lot of hype around that, and I wanted to get your opinion. And I always tell my listeners, when it comes to most of these things and different organizations, they're filled with humans, and humans are flawed, and they're going to kind of conglomerate into their own little factions. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire organization is a bad thing as a whole. But I mean, you're the guy to ask. Like when you worked for the FBI, was there any noticeable instances of corruption or drastically like distasteful behavior or operations, as far as you were concerned, that you were aware of? The good, the bad, anything in general, just whatever you got. I'm curious.
Well, what you notice is if you're in that world long enough, you learn that the majority of the agents and the folks working in that world are decent people that are doing it right. Your corruption is in small numbers in key positions. Okay. And they will use some of the lower level, rank and file, of course. But for the most part, the serious corruption, low numbers, but key positions. What you're usually up against most of the time is incompetence. And just as you've heard, and gets around that phrase where you incompetence gets promoted. Yeah, that's what you notice. I saw that in the FBI. So you see that in the military. You see it pretty much everywhere. And the reason they do that is because the idea is that the field work is really where the rubber meets the road. That's where the crucial stuff is done. And you want to get the incompetence out of the field, out of the way of the people who do know what they're doing. Because, again, that word incompetence can be dangerous out in the field. So that's why a lot of times you'll see people that aren't so sharp being moved up the ladder where they can be out of the way, and hopefully their bad decisions, if they make any, the results can be minimized. Now, what I saw, excuse me, that I didn't like was after 9/11. Between what I saw and friends that were either still in the FBI or in the OSI and such, what you saw after 9/11 was this curious pushing out and pushing away of your experience base, and the rush to hire new, young, inexperienced people. Of course, they can pay them less money, so they're cheaper, but also they're newer. They're more willing to do what the boss says. They're thinking of their careers. They're excited to just be there in that world. Whereas, someone who's experienced, who's been around, who's been seasoned, those people think, and they think armed with the experience. So those are the people, your experienced people tend to be the ones who smell a rat or notice when something's not being done right. And I'm in that school of thought that, as many people are, that with 9/11 came quite frankly, some shady national security community behavior. And one of the ways that they could get away with that is this very thing: push your experienced people away, push them aside, put the inexperience, in there, so that you can control them better. And so there was that. I did witness that, but it's everywhere. You're gonna see the stupidity. You're gonna find the corruption everywhere. But it really is among the smaller numbers of people. That said, what disturbs me is when I see these days so many agents willing to participate in questionable actions, like searches that are politically motivated, or things along those lines. I don't know. I guess I'm glad I'm not an agent these days, because there's a couple of things that I already would have turned my badge in over, because I would not have enforced. One of my things was back in the 90s, every decade they talk about the Second Amendment. We got to repeal the Second Amendment, or we got to control guns, we got to blah, blah, blah. And I told my mentor, okay, I said, look, while I'm carrying this federal badge, if the edict ever comes down that I got to be part of, taking the guns away from the people, I will turn my badge in on that day. I will not enforce that. Yeah. Fortunately, it didn't come to that, but I would have. And he agreed with me. He says, I'm right with you. Don't worry about it. So that just kind of gives you a little glimpse as to where I'm coming from.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And okay, and so like in terms of something like operations as counterintelligence or counterterrorism and that sort of stuff, what kind of stuff does that entail? Like, what are some of the standard operating procedures, or just kind of insight into that world for maybe me and the listeners to be aware of?
Well, I loved it. I loved the operational parts of the job. I love the trade craft, surveillance. And, there's a lot of, between agents and cops, a lot of badge carriers do not like surveillance. They find it boring. I love it. And in fact, that was my primary specialty throughout my entire career. I was on a special surveillance team for the FBI, and we got special training for that. And then, as an OSI agent, surveillance was a major part of what I did, and we had to have special training, more special training on that. And then when I was in counterterrorism, I got yet additional training that was probably the most immersive training in physical surveillance. So I am a bona fide physical surveillance expert.
Yeah. Yeah, to me that sort of thing always seemed super attractive, and I don't know, it seemed interesting to me. I just, as a bystander watching things on movies or TV, which I don't know how close to the truth that, all that is, but it does seem like it would be like an entertaining and fun thing, in my opinion.
Yes, surveillance requires patience, and you got to be someone with patience, but the payoffs and the thrill when it's working, it's a blast. And I run very discreet. As a private investigator, I'm often hired by other PIs who don't have anywhere near the experience I have, so they'll hire me to do their surveillances, and I tell them, do not hire me and expect me to do your surveillance over a weekend and get you what you want, because I don't work that way. I will get you results and still not max out your hours, but I won't cram things in over a weekend, because that'll force me to do things against my own professional standards and experience, and I won't do that. I will not sacrifice my professional reputation for just some PI who wants to rush it.
Definitely.
And,
Great things take time, as they say.
well, if to get results, you got to be patient in that world. And then there's the investigative aspects too, where you're just out there either knocking on doors, or you're going out there looking around, snooping around with things. And in the counterintelligence, counterespionage world, you're also getting exposed to advanced technology, at least as an Air Force agent. And you're learning things about, in that case, our aircraft and military technology that sometimes is pretty mind-blowingly cool.
Hmm.
So it was stuff that I loved. I really enjoyed what I did for the FBI, which was a little different, but not entirely, from what I did with Air Force OSI, which in itself was that much different from the FBI and from the counterterrorism. But each of those sections of my career served the next one, right? So
Absolutely.
it was, now the counterterrorism job, that was I was living the life of Riley, as they say. I was spending 7 or 8 months of the year out of the country, in a different country every month. I was paid the best money of my life, doing cool stuff, sometimes in war zones. I had to go to Afghanistan multiple times, did Iraq once. But sometimes, what we called city gigs, where I was staying in a 4 or 5 star hotel and having, an operational week that was only 2 hours. So the rest of my week while I was there was just serving my cover. And I got a lot of writing done. I wrote 2 novels while on that job. So it was, and I saw a big, cool chunk of the world as well. So, those 20 years were great. And I've done some cool things since leaving that work too. So,
And
so
now,
far,
out
so
of
good.
out of curiosity, were there any places in the world where you weren't allowed to go in terms of being restricted from your employment as an FBI agent? I only asked because I had a family member who was involved in some similar things, but he wasn't allowed to go to Egypt, for example. And for what reasons exactly, I'm not sure.
Yeah. After the FBI, I was not allowed to go to obviously places in the former Soviet Union, specifically in Russia, like Moscow, that would have been not smart. However, I did. I'm sorry, after the FBI and after the Air Force, because in the Air Force, I'll put it to you this way: in the work I was in, if you do what I did, anybody who did what I did, I'm not that special. Anybody who did what I did for the, the amount of time I did it, you're going to end up, particularly with my specialty at Wright-Patterson, you're going to end up with a dossier on you in Moscow or Beijing. I worked mostly against the Soviets and then the early post-coup Russia, which is not the Russia today. And they build that dossier. So they got to know my face for the first time after I'd been on the surveillance team in San Francisco. And they take photos of everybody on the FBI surveillance so that when future KGB agents would come to San Francisco, for example, they would be shown this book and they'd say, know these faces. These are the FBI people who are going to be following you. Well, then down the road, as I'm an Air Force agent and my face pops up in certain places doing certain things, there's somebody who we do it too, we'll compare the photos and go, oh, this guy who we've identified as Air Force Agent Bosley, there he was a few years ago on the San Francisco surveillance team or whatever, right? So they begin to build a dossier. Okay. And because of that, Walter Bosley was not allowed to go to certain places. However, when I was in counterterrorism, I never traveled as Walter Bosley. So I did that work right in that last window of years before biometrics came out. Now, just as I left that work in 2006, my understanding is that Frankfurt Airport started using biometrics. What does that mean to someone like me? Well, when you're the same face in multiple passports. Like if I'd gone through Frankfurt under one name and then 2 months later gone through Frankfurt under another name, they would have noticed that because of the biometrics. So I don't know how that's affected tradecraft, but
Frankfurt's in Germany too, right? Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. And so I did go to some former Soviet bloc countries, just not under my name.
Okay. All right. Well, that's fascinating. It's a fascinating world. It's really
now.
cool.
Now I've been gone out of that long enough that here's how it works. If I chose to, or on some work had to go, say, to Moscow, I'm still required to let the FBI and the Air Force OSI know that. I have to say, hey, this is where I'm going. And I had a situation come up where a few years ago, get this, somebody wanted me to go to the Ukraine as his personal security advisor, person to go along with him. And when I talked to the FBI, they were like, yeah, okay, be careful. We don't care. You don't need to call us back. But the OSI agents, and this is a thumbs up to OSI, that guy said, hey, all right, before you go, come by the det. Let me give you a briefing. And then after you get back, come back and tell me everything you saw. And I'm like, that's how you do it. That's the right answer. The FBI should have been telling me the same thing. What it is if you're a good intelligence collector, you're wanting to take advantage of opportunities. And if you got a former agent, okay, who's going somewhere you're interested in, oh yeah, you want to talk to that guy before he goes and after he gets back. That's how you do that job. So I went around the barn to answer your question, but I do have to report before I go to certain places, and they'll let me know if I can't go or not at that time.
All righty. All right. So full disclosure, I'm a little ashamed to say I haven't read your work as much as I'd like to completely, but I've listened to you on a lot of different, recordings and been listening to you off and on for a while now. So I'm vaguely familiar with a lot of different stuff, but regardless, there's so much we can get into, but to kind of like set the foundation, I want to get into like who was Charles Dalshaw, what is NYMZA, and what is the Sonora Aero Club? Or actually, maybe as an interesting side note, maybe it would be cool to start off with like in terms of phenomenon, like ancient technology and flying machines, if we could sort of like get into like the Mahabharata, like and talk a little bit about the old stuff. Like, I think that it's really interesting because a lot of the common opinion in this regard is that a lot of the phenomena, quote unquote, or ancient crafts or crafts in general are more of a modern thing. But maybe we could talk a little bit about, like, what is the Mahabharata? What's this text about? What are some of the interesting aspects in your opinion in regard to this? And then maybe we can move forward into the future. But yeah.
Okay, well, that's like a big chunk. In a nutshell, and I'm looking at my copy, an edition of the Mahabharata from about 25 years ago. It's about that thick. It's right over there on my shelf. I can't reach it from here, but the Mahabharata is the ancient epic of I think, forgive me for not knowing specifically, but I think the Rama Empire stuff. But basically, when you're talking about the ancient technology of India, you're talking about what is called the Rama Empire, and this is the long ago India. Um, and there is talk in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, another ancient book, of these just destructive, terribly destructive wars with, for all intents and purposes, advanced technology, flying machines, missiles, you name it, nuclear weaponry, that kind of thing. And among that technology are vague discussions of the flying machines, which people will often confuse with a more specific discussion of the flying machines referred to as Vimanas, which is in a much more recent, historically
So those are actually different.
Well, the Vimana is a word from ancient Hindu scripture and history and stuff, ancient Indian, the Rama Empire and all that. But the specific description of a Vimana that people often cite, which is the Mercury vortex engine, you've probably heard of that. This comes from a book called I'm not even going to attempt. Well, it's the something. It's a book that it's a 2 S words. I can't even. I don't have it in front of me.
Oh man, I wonder.
Unfortunately,
Do you know what language is it? Like a Hebrew or a Sanskrit thing, or
it's Sanskrit.
Okay.
It's Sanskrit. But see, that book only dates back to 1908, and it wasn't translated into English until, I want to say, 1952, something like that. And people will often confuse the description of Vimanas and the Mercury vortex engine and so forth. What's in that 1908 book, they'll say, oh, that was in the ancient books. And it's not. It's from a more recent work. Now, here's what's interesting about that. This ties into Charles Delschow. Delschow was a German immigrant who came to the United States via Texas, to Galveston Harbor, I believe, via Texas in, I think it was 1850, but it was in the 1850s. And he was kind of contracted. It was a contract gig, sent by this mysterious group that he identified as NYMZA, NYMZA, all capital letters, which he identified as being based in Germany. Okay. And they sent him out. They brought him to the States, and he was to go to California, where I am now, come to California here, and go observe and report on this group of other German immigrants called the Sonora Aero Club, AERO. And basically, these guys were German and Italian, a few of them immigrants who were building flying machines in the 1850s, the decade before the American Civil War. And they weren't hot air balloons. These were, for all intents and purposes, what appeared to be, even to our 21st century thinking, anti-gravity contraptions. Well, Delschow documented, chronicled their exploits, and documented everything he observed. And in the 1890s, I think starting in 1893, shortly before the airship mystery broke out in the 1890s, Delshow started writing these books about the Sonora Aero Club, their story, and drawing numerous hundreds of illustrations of these flying machines that these German immigrants were designing and building and flying around up in Tuolumne County, California, which is the gold country villages just west of Yosemite National Park. Okay, so we're talking 2 hours south of Sacramento. Now, according to Delshow, the Sonora Aero Club was kind of being sponsored by NYMZA, that mysterious German group. And at one point, according to Delshow, NYMZA sent their representative, who Delshow only referred to as that Prussian officer. Nobody liked him. Nobody wanted him to be there. And he was communicating the desire of NYMZA for these guys in the Aero Club to build these flying machines equipped for military application, to make them war machines. And the leader of the Sonora Aero Club and the other members did not want to do that, so they refused. Not long after that refusal, we are told that the leader of the Aero Club dies in an explosion while flying one of his arrows, one of his flying machines. And that's the end of the Aero Club. Well, Delshow writes down this story, does hundreds of these illustrations, and they're colorful, they're in detail. And in those illustrations, he draws multiple schematics of what the engine of these things, right? The propulsions, what made them work. And I subsequently discovered that they're identical to what's called the Rankine turbine, Rankine turbine. Okay, I said turbine. Okay, which that schematic and design was first published in 1849, just a few years before the Sonora Aero Club, started doing what they were doing, at least what Delshow witnessed. Now, what's interesting is there is rotation, there is heat, there's some mysterious liquid that Delshow, all he knew about it was that the leader called it the soup. And it was this, according to Delshow, it was green in color, but we never learned anything else about it. And it worked in conjunction with the heat and going through this contraption, and there was rotation and spinning. And this is very similar to the concept of the mercury vortex engine. However, again, what Delshow drew and illustrated was virtually identical to the Rankine turbine, published in 1849. So where Rankine got this idea, we don't know exactly. But here's what's interesting. Delshow died in 1923. He never published these books. They were never public until they were never seen by anyone until 1971, and never became public until after that. So what's interesting is how similar, not only in the propulsion system, the motive machinery, but in some of the very shapes of the Vimanas, how similar they are to these arrows as depicted by Delshow. Okay. And what's interesting is, though, that the Vimana material to which I refer, again, shows up in a book published in 1908 that was written in Sanskrit that was not known in the English world until the 1950s. So Delshow was dead for 25 or 30 years before, this Sanskrit book that I refer to was published. So it looks like Delshow was reporting the Sonora Aero Club getting the idea for their engine and their stuff from the Rankine turbine.
Wow.
Okay. And the author of the Sanskrit book could not have known about Delshau's arrows. Okay, even the shapes of some of the arrows themselves, okay, are identical to what's in the 1908 book. So what is this suggesting? Well, perhaps some knowledge of an ancient technological tradition that had been passed down through various sources. And Rankin, Macorn Rankin, I think that's his first name, he was one of the co-founders of the study of thermodynamics. The other guy is the more famous one, and I forget his name because this research, has me focusing on Rankin. So it looks to me like whatever the thread was of this specific technology we're talking about, from two very different, similar technology, same technology from two different sources, suggests to me that there was some type of tradition of this knowledge that had been passed down through the ages, through the centuries. That's the school of thought I'm in.
Yeah.
And the Nazi bell is in the mix because, as well as my discovery that the Rankine turbine was the model for the Sonora Aero Club engines, motors, according to Delshau. I also discovered within the Delshau material what is exactly the bell. Okay, and it also pretty much is a replica of the so-called Vimana technology from that 1908 book. And this helps support the idea that there was some knowledge of ancient technology, because the bell, the Sonora Aero Club was using a rudimentary proof of concept version of the bell. Okay, and they were German immigrants, and we have 70 or 80 years later, we allegedly have Nazi German scientists using a more advanced version of the bell. See the connection? Germans in the 1850s, Germans in the 1930s. Okay, so what do we have in between those two different Germans of different eras? We got a whole thread of German industrialists, German scientists who are also occultists, who are also interested in ancient knowledge, lost technology. So I argue that the Sonora Aero Club was actually using the bell, the concept we call the Glocke, the Nazi bell, and what they learned from it was passed down through, including showing up, the essential idea showing up in the 1890s airship mystery, and then showing up in World War II era Nazi Germany. And what this does is this throws out the window, flushes down the toilet, the nonsense that the Nazis got the idea for Die Glocke, the bell, from a crashed flying saucer from another world. Because that's another thing that makes me real popular with some people, is that the Haunebu, all of that post-war neo-Nazi, Nazi survival myth nonsense. It has been traced to a guy named Ernst Zundel and some neo-Nazi propaganda nonsense articles in Italy, initially published after the war, after World War II. The Haunebus, there never was anything like that. It's all fake, but it's fun, so people like to perpetuate it and yell at Walter Bosley when he tells them it's
I'm sure they do. That's fascinating. If anyone out there is interested in purchasing any elixirs, any spagyrics, or any alchemically prepared medicinal formulations for that matter, please go on over and check out, first and foremost, medicinebuddhalabs.com. This is operated by Taylor Doretti. If you haven't listened to any of the episodes that I've done with him, go ahead and do so. He's somebody that does things of quality, and I have consumed multiple offerings of Taylor's. Excellent, highly recommend them, and enter PM Podcast at checkout for 10% off of any of your order. So then I want you to check out chaotique.com, and this is going to be the work of the great Roger Lambert, and That is actually spelled EAUXCHAOTIQUES.com. Echaotique, I guess that's how you pronounced it. Talk to Roger, that's what he told me. So go check that out, because he has just added a crap load of amazing stuff to his website. He's got all kinds of offerings, from plant things to fungi to a mineral metallic works. Even if you're not interested, just go check that out. And if you are interested and you want to purchase something, enter Philopod at checkout for 15% off of your order. If any of you are interested in consumable gold, RM potable perhaps, highly recommend the templeofmercury.com. That's going to be the work of the great Benjamin Terrell. He's the man. Philocast at checkout for 15% off of your order. Yeah, I was going to ask, so this man that you kind of mentioned earlier that died in this flying machine that was recorded, to your knowledge, is there any wreckage or any parts or any pieces or anything anywhere, to your knowledge, like something that has been recovered, or maybe, I don't know, potentially usurped by any particular groups or agencies? Or would this be things that are found like in regards to like the Nazi battle technologies?
Part of my research into the Sonora Aero Club is always inclusive of looking for any possibility of finding any kind of debris or evidence or relic. I don't think there'd be any debris, because I think it would have been cleaned up immediately by the Aero Club. I don't think the leader of the club died. His name was Peter Menis, Mennis. I don't think he died. I think he faked his death. And just took off to live under another name, another identity. In my book, Secret Missions 3, Destination Carcosa, which is about Ambrose Bierce, I suggest in there that, I lay out my argument for why I think the Sonora Aero Club is linked to the 1890s airship mystery and how. And one of the hypotheses, it's just a speculation, but I think that Peter Menis, during our Civil War, was either served during the war in some capacity, and may have crossed paths with a man named Solomon Andrews, who demonstrated in the 1860s during the war. He demonstrated a controlled flying machine, not a balloon. It was not a hot air balloon. It was a different thing. And he had contacted Abraham Lincoln to tell him he had this device. And Lincoln told Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, to have his people look at Solomon Andrews' flying machine. And sure enough, I think it was 1863 or 4, Andrews demonstrated it in Washington, D.C., right there on the mall, I think, on one of the lawns. And it was witnessed by members of Lincoln's War Department, and also newspaper reporters. It was reported. And I lay out a huge speculative hypothesis that we are told that Andrews was told, no, thank you, we're in the middle of a war, we have no use for this. But I think more likely it would have been, okay, we're in the middle of a war, we can't develop this right now, but we're gonna keep your address, Mr. Andrews, and we're gonna get in touch with you after the war. And I propose that America's first black technology project was actually the Andrews airship. And 30 years later, okay, after the end of the war, 30 years of development later, we end up with the 1890s airship mystery. And I lay all this out in the book, Destination Carcosa, and what Bierce's connection would be to it. And I talk a little bit about it also in my book Origin, but it's really interesting when you look closely at those things. You really do see that this idea that they're connected is likely not crazy.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and that's fascinating. Let's leave a little bit of that for maybe the listeners if they're interested to
Sure.
Maybe check out some of your books. But I want to, on the kind of note of things being connected, maybe let's, Talbot Mundy and the Caves of Terror. So in my research, when I just because I've heard about this from you, Talbot Mundy, he wrote under the name Walter Galt, and I myself I couldn't find any books authored by, at least available online, or at least under any name of Walter Galt. I was curious, have you yourself come across any maybe archives or elsewhere of Walter Galt and works under that name?
Not yet. And well, I know he was born under the name Walter Gribben. Gribben was his birth name, and Talbot Mundy was his pen name. What's interesting about the Walter Galt story is we have, of course, the John Galt figure from Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand. But I do think, and I'm glad you brought up Talbot Mundy because he's one of my favorite
I have
authors.
a couple of reasons I brought that up, but I'll let you go ahead.
And as you know, I have recently, my publishing label has released 4 of his works in new editions. Yes. And I'm really excited about those. And of course, I was reading from Caves of Terror a couple weeks ago on my live stream. Mundy is a guy who I think in his travels and through his connections learned some pretty interesting stuff, some secrets, both ancient, occult secrets and political secrets that were contemporary to his time. When he wrote about the 9 unknown men, this is a concept that was talked about by Madame Blavatsky, who for me is kind of a mixed bag. Madame Helena Blavatsky wrote some legitimate stuff. Excuse me, I have a dry throat.
No worries.
She wrote some legitimate stuff, but she also could be a totally unreliable source on other things. You have to take her with a grain of salt, a block of salt sometimes. But this idea that there were these 9 mysterious men with this special knowledge, this was something that intrigued Mundy. And of course, it shows up in more than just one book. He did write his book, The 9 Unknown, but this concept of ancient lost knowledge intrigued him, and it's a part of all of his works. And I'm going to be publishing even more of his books in new editions, because I think he's a writer who has mostly been forgotten and yet had great influence on his genre, even to this day. As I've mentioned before, when I talk about him, Talbot Mundy was really the guy who originated the style of adventure story that we see with the movie Gunga Din, which of course is based on a Kipling poem. But the way the story, the story in the movie is an extrapolation from that poem, and it's very much a Talbot Mundy type of tale. The Man Who Would Be King, again, based on a Kipling story, but the way John Huston wrote it and directed it, that's very much a Talbot Mundy story. And the ultimate, of course, of the Indiana Jones films. That's Talbot Mundy would have loved and recognized his own style in himself in the Indiana Jones film. So,
and you're talking, sorry, you're talking about his, like in terms of Kipling poem, you're talking about Roger Kipling, is that correct?
Rudyard Kipling, yeah.
Okay, because I was going to say
Rudyard Kipling wrote the poem Gunga Din, but the film is an extrapolation from that.
Yeah, and I had a set of books at one point by Roger Kipling, and on the books they had the swastika, but not in the sense of like the Nazi sense, but it was actually the original, intention behind like maybe it links to like India or Tibet or something along those lines. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, unfortunately, the Nazis put their stain on certain things, the swastika being a big one. But hopefully with time, people will be able to take back the
hopefully
meanings of things,
For sure. So I was listening to a recording that you did with the Brothers of the Serpent podcast where you were discussing your Secret Mission series, actually. And Maybe you can give a brief introduction that touches on some of the aspects of the series, and then I have a couple of questions in
Sure.
regards to that.
Basically, that series didn't start out as a series. I don't generally my books are one has led to the other, and even though they may seem to be in diverse topics, they actually have very specific and distinct connections. One
Yeah.
book truly has led to the other. And the Secret Missions series I'm really proud of, because I just that it's never ending. I'm always finding legitimately more to write about when I pull those threads. But it started out as the one book, Secret Missions, the Hidden Legacy of Old California.
Mm.
I think I get my own subtitle wrong sometimes, and it was about Juan Cabrillo. And I had not known, I grew up in California, and the name Juan Cabrillo is everywhere, but I had not known the details of his story. I had not known that nobody knows where he was born, and I didn't know that he was Portuguese, not Spanish, and I didn't know that his death is a mystery. To this day, no one knows where he's buried, and he died on the expedition that he's famous for. Well, the more I looked into him, the more I also discovered evidence that he might have been a Templar.
Interesting.
And yeah, and that he was definitely, when I read the logs and the accounts of the expedition, he was definitely looking for something that his crew didn't know about.
And say what was his name again?
Juan Cabrillo.
Juan Cabrillo. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, go
And
on.
in that first book I present, I think I know why we don't know where he was born. I think I know some things about him which would explain the Templar connection. And I also present the idea that he faked his death on that expedition, and I present why. The book also goes into the lost sword of Joan of Arc. Again, I didn't know there was a lost sword. So what happened was I had the sword of Joan of Arc, which is missing to this day. And then I had Juan Cabrillo, whose life was a mystery. He entered the stage of history. He was already like 19 or 20 years old. We know nothing, about the specifics. And then, he dies mysteriously. 3 different versions of his death from his own crew who witnessed it. And nobody knows where he was born or buried. I mean, so this was a big fat mystery. And so I wrote that book. I was pleased with how that turned out. And while I was writing it, get this, I've kind of admired the British explorer Sir Richard Francis Burton for several years.
Yeah.
And while I was writing the Cabrillo book, I happened to be reading some stuff about Burton, and I thought I knew a lot about Burton, but I learned that that Burton, when he had gone to South America, he had a missing gap of about 6 months. Okay. Uh, Nobody knows exactly where he was. He had ridden into the South American wilderness and emerges months later, not talking about where he'd been and what he'd done. Now, Burton is a man who wrote profusely about everything he did. I mean, I've read a bunch of his works, and there's some dry stuff. His 3-week stay in Salt Lake City is probably one of the most excruciating books you ever would drag yourself through. This is a man who wrote about everything he did, except, and I narrowed it down, the 4.5-month period that he disappears into the South American wilderness and then reappears haggard, clothes tattered, catatonic, drinking in a tavern in Lima, Peru. And a guy walks in and says, "Oh, there you are, Captain Burton. You got your next assignment." He gets up, and the witnesses say that he looked all haggard when the guy walked in and told him that news. He got up, suddenly looked like he was full of energy, got up, walked off, and that was it. And to this day, nowhere in his writings is his explanation as to what he was doing. Well, that right there, to me, was another Secret Missions book. So that's how I ended up writing Secret Missions 2, The Lost Expedition of Sir Richard Francis Burton. And boy, that one was my personal favorite of all the books I had written from a from from a writing point of view, research author. I'm really proud of the work I did on that book. Oh, and by the way, right now we're working up a tour, a literary tour, focusing on the Burton book, which will
Oh,
go
nice.
to Argentina, which will go to Brazil, which will go to Lake Titicaca, and then into Peru. And I'm hoping
That's
that
awesome.
we have that tour ready to go and available sometime next calendar year. So look for that. But yeah, so yeah, after writing the Burton book, while writing the Burton book, while in the middle of writing it, I stumbled on some information about Ambrose Bierce. And again, it was, wait a minute, we're told that Ambrose Bierce rode into Mexico and was never heard from again and was probably shot during the Mexican War. But guess what? His body was never found. Ambrose Bierce is a well known mystery. And I thought, wait a minute, I got to look into that next. So after I finished the Burton book, started looking into the Bierce book. And basically, what happened was the series focuses on these historical figures, most of them some type of explorer or you know guy interested in these kinds of things, who either his death is a mystery, or there's a missing chunk of his life, like with Burton, um, in Bierce. And then the fourth one was the esoteric Napoleon,
Mm.
and that was, wow, that's a biggie. In fact, I'm writing volume 2 of that later this year because there's so much there. But basically, that's what the series is. I take these figures who were interested in, they were all interested, no matter what century they were in, no matter what different line of work they came from, they were all interested in the lost ancient civilizations and the forgotten technology of those civilizations. And that's the main thread that runs through all of them. But the criteria to get a Secret Missions book written about you
Mhm.
is to disappear. No one can find your body. No one knows what's happened to you. Or to have a big, fat, mysterious chunk of, you know, time in your life that's missing, that no one knows what you were doing and you didn't talk about. So
Yes,
I've already got um, the next subject, the next person who another Secret Missions book will be about, but I'm in the middle of researching him
that's
in
all.
depth.
Yeah. So I brought up that recording with the Brothers of the Serpent podcast in particular because I believe on that recording you discussed in regards to Sir Richard Burton's explorations in India, some caves or cave
Yeah,
systems with, the walls were like coated in masonry, you were saying.
yeah.
And then I also heard you mention the same thing being brought up with Talbot Mundy in the Caves of Terror fiction
Yes.
book. So I was wondering, are these caves related? And is there a relation between Talbot Mundy and Sir Richard Burton? Because if I recall, I did some like some looking into, like Talbot Mundy was a member of the British police force in India for 25 years. And then we have Richard Burton. He's a British explorer who was a captain of the army and the East India Company serving in India. So it just feels like there's some sort of connection there. And I was wondering if you've drawn any like parallels or conclusions or any linkage between the two, because I don't know, it just seems like there's something there.
Well, between those two directly, I don't think there was any even overlap in their lives, because I think Burton died before Mundy was
Mhm.
born, or if Mundy had been born, he was an infant when Burton died. However, there is another fascinating figure in history who I think could be the bridge between Burton and Mundy, and that, of course, is Colonel Percy Fawcett. Because Fawcett's life, I believe, bridged Burton and Mundy, and certainly Fawcett's interests were right in line with Talbot Mundy. And I'm glad you asked that question, because as of yet, I haven't looked at the connection, any possible connection between Mundy and Fawcett, whether they ever met. It is certainly possible, I think, that they did, and that's an interesting thing to consider.
And what do you think about the caves, the caves things? Because it seemed like the description of the caves in both of those instances were very similar.
Yeah, the caves that Burton visited are well known. I think it's Ellafora, or it's Elleph something. You'll have to forgive me. I wrote that book in 2015, and I've written a bunch of stuff since then. So
Yeah.
bless, I have it sitting in front of me. And absolutely, Mundy, I'm sure, visited those very same caves.
Okay.
So, the inspiration source is there, right?
Yeah.
However, I like to think, and I suspect, that both, Burton and Mundy may have been made privy to caves we don't know about.
Okay. And then, okay. So we got like maybe 30 minutes left. So I want to ask you, so the subject of UFOs or interdimensional entities and or contact, I'd love to get you to describe yourself, your personal experience, and then as well your dad's, because I have some particular questions in regards to your dad's experience. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what's interesting is that particular book I have right here, the one about my dad. Oh shoot,
What's that one called?
Shimmering Light.
Shimmering Light.
Yeah, let me it's under a stack here, under a bunch of stuff. This one here, Shimmering Light.
Oh, okay.
That's
Is that
my
a photo
dad
of your
on the
dad
cover.
right
Yep,
there?
that's him.
Oh,
And yeah, my and I won't do the long version on this. As a kid, little kid, we had these magazines, Life and Look and stuff, that had UFO articles in them, because my dad was fascinated with this. And we're talking the late 60s going into the early 70s. And I remember in 1974 is when I first heard of what we subsequently called the Roswell incident. 1974. Remember, the Roswell incident as such was not presented publicly until a book in 1980. Okay. So 6 years before that, my dad's telling my sisters and I was, 10 years old that summer, turning 11 that fall, that when he was in the Air Force, he learned about something that crashed in the New Mexico desert, and it essentially came from another world. And it was, there were bodies recovered and so forth. And I remember when I first saw the Roswell incident book and looked at it, I thought, well, this is the thing my dad's talking about. However, over the years, and as I talked about it more, and I learned more about things, and my mentor got a hold of me, my dad made it clear that they weren't from space. They weren't from another world. They were from our world. But he told this story of them being in this underground civilization, and the thing was, when he told the story, it was so intense that he truly was telling the truth as he knew it. Well, through the years and through my career, I learned more about different things, and I was on board with the ET UFO thing until around 1986, when in my reading all the stuff that was available then and thinking about it, I saw what looked to me like a connection to advanced military technology. Also, I had seen an analysis of UFO sightings relative to other strange phenomena, and specifically a correlation to the intersections of what they were calling ley lines, which I've since learned is specifically telluric current, which I've written a lot about.
Yes.
And that brought in the potential for an interdimensional possibility. So by the late 80s, I was less intrigued with people from another planet than I was the advanced secret military technology, beings from other dimensions, or even including time travelers, right?
Mm.
These things were much more fascinating to me than ET. So but I had never seen a UFO. Never, all those years, I never saw one. I go through my career, learn what I learn some more things about my dad from a superior officer. And I'm encouraged by that officer to continue digging into getting my dad to talk more and more about his weird experience. And um, and some just really mind-boggling things came out about it, so that he died in 2008, and by 2016 I decided, you know what, I've really got to write my dad's story. I've really got to dig into this, and I got to be objective, and that resulted in this book.
Mm-hmm.
So the bottom line is, I think my dad, because of his specialty, he was, as a matter of fact, involved with the U.S. Air Force manned space program effort of the mid to late 50s, which is a very real historical thing. The Mercury program started with the Air Force and was handed to NASA when NASA was stood up in October of 1958. So my dad was involved in that. That would have been, it was deeply classified. Okay. And I think because this was also the era that the United States Air Force had learned about MK Ultra, in the book I talk about why I think what my dad believed and what he talked about for years may have been a false narrative to
Yeah.
to suppress him from talking about very classified things. Um, so it requires me to be honest and say my dad's story may not be true like he
Mm.
believed it was, but I believe in pursuing the truth.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I will say that that's absolutely a valid possibility. And but for the record, I'll also say it was just curious to me because and then listening to you, I've heard that your dad's story was east of Winslow in Arizona,
Yeah,
and
that's
I'm in
what he said.
Arizona, and
Oh, okay.
I'm it's just very curious to me because my ex-wife and I actually had purchased some land east of Winslow.
Oh, really?
Yes,
we may
and
we may have to talk. I might want to pick your brain. Oh, by the way, I eventually did have my one extraordinary UFO encounter in 2014, a
uh,
couple of years before I wrote this book, but I
oh, okay.
forgot to throw that in there.
Yeah, do you want to mention that real quick or?
Yeah, it was my daughter and her boyfriend live here at the house, and he's a chef and a restaurant manager guy, and he was coming in late from work and came running in the house and said, "Hey, Walter, there's something over the house." And so I go out there thinking, okay, it's going to be a helicopter or a satellite or something. And I go out and I look up, and mind boggling. And my instinct was I ran inside, I got my camera, okay, and I came out, it was still there, and I started filming, okay. So I captured this incident on film, on tape, because it was an old, digital tape thing, Sony Handycam thing. And here's what's interesting. It was about, and even though I was in the Air Force, I'm terrible at offhand, quick measurements of elevation. But honestly, it could not have been more than 70 feet above the house. Okay. So it was fairly low. And it was round, flat bottom, dome top. There was something rotating inside, and there was some type of illumination caused by um, heat, I guess you'd say, um, or some type of energy. Okay,
Mm,
and this was rotating inside, and you could see the glow of it and the rotation through. I could tell the shape of the thing because the dome part. Okay. Um, you can make out the outline because of the illumination within, right? So imagine it was like
yeah.
some type of clear, material, and it stayed level. It wasn't jumping around. It wasn't moving in the wind like if it had been a Chinese lantern or something. Nothing like that. And it was probably Depending upon how high it actually was, I would say it was maybe 15, as small as 15 feet in diameter, maybe 25 feet if it was bigger than I'm imagining or remembering. And it stayed right there, maintained its attitude and its altitude
Mm.
while I was filming. And then after a few moments, it started dumping this molten substance over the side. I mean, just big dumps of it. So again, this could not have been a candle in a Chinese lantern. There was just too much of it. And the thing was maintaining again. It wasn't wobbling, it was steady. And as it started doing that, then it started moving very controlled, very level, away from the house,
Wow.
and then disappeared into the low cloud cover. And when I went to follow the path that it took, what I found was a burnt substance like fluffy charcoal that when I tried to collect it with tweezers and then in a baggie, it was very fragile and then eventually just crumbled into dust and disintegrated over the course of time. And that was my UFO experience.
Yeah.
I have a video on that at the Walter Bosley channel at my YouTube channel, and it's from my presentation I did at Contact in the Desert a couple years ago during COVID when they had to do it online, and you can see the more details and the weird, interesting connections to another part of my research that I had been doing. So the bottom line is the UFO encounter I had again had nothing to do with extraterrestrials. It had to do with something weirder that I
Yeah.
still haven't answered yet.
Ooh, yeah, that is so fascinating. And yeah, so back to this land and the
Mm-hmm.
spot that we purchased in East Winslow, is very much off the grid. And I will say the moon out there at night was absolutely insane. It was
I'll
backed up
bet.
to a canyon. The canyon actually encompassed some of our property. It's called Black Canyon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the stars just amazing as well. Many times I'd be staring at the stars and what I thought were stars or whatever, and then I'd be watching them and they'd be eventually they'd start to move, and so I would start to film them with my camera, and they would go through a series of different colors, and I don't know, maybe it was something else, but it was just fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole spot was really interesting in particular. But anyway, there was the land that this was nearby was on this ranch that was owned by this particular family. So across from the canyon were these series of like sinkholes.
Yeah,
And I
I think
guess,
I've seen pictures of that.
yeah, it's technically, I think it's in like the Holbrook Basin,
Yeah.
and there's like about 50 of them in these like semi-concentric pattern of like nested rings or whatever. And
Yeah.
I've gone over there and I've collected like some rocks and stuff, and I think that it's said that they're a result of dissolution of like salt beds from millions of years ago or whatever, but they're like sinkholes. But I've read that also sinkholes are indicative of caverns, being beneath them, and I think that that's interesting because we also had uh installed a well on our property, and
Mm-hmm.
when they're digging it, every so feet they go down, they collect samples of the rocks, so you could see each as they go down. And we went way deeper than we needed to because we wanted more reserve for water or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but there were some gaps in between of just empty air pockets, which obviously is indicative of
Interesting.
caverns.
Yeah.
And on top of that, there are some spots in those canyons around there that have these like petroglyphs, or hieroglyphs, yeah, petroglyphs on the
Petroglyphs. Yeah.
walls.
Mm-hmm.
And there was someone that I had came across, and I don't remember who it was or what video, but he was discussing a lot of these petroglyphs as being related to cave systems, and they were inscribing the cave systems that were in the lands or under the
Mm-hmm.
land. And that's what they would do when they were marking out some of these petroglyphs. And I just find that so interesting when I listen to that in comparison with your dad's story. And I'm not saying that it's true, because maybe it could totally be, the, like you're saying, like MK Ultra type situation. But I just found the whole scenario fascinating between my experiences and my actual experience in those locations with your dad.
Well, in the book, I identify Holbrook as the
Mm.
place I think my dad was doing something that's
Mm-hmm.
involved with this. But here's the thing: by the end of the book, I also, again, to be totally honest, I present the MK Ultra false narrative option as one option because the context of the history and what he was involved in, you cannot ignore the presence of MK Ultra with the Air Force then. However, between the lore and between what you're describing with what's under the ground, I honestly also cannot say for certain that those parts of his story about the underground people and what's down there, I can't say for sure that that's not true. And that's the crazy thing about the story. It could be that both of them are true, that he was MK Ultra, because I was told that in the late 90s when I was in the Air Force that those techniques were applied to him, but they never said that what he said specifically was a false narrative. So in my book, I leave it open that he could very well have been telling the truth about people down there, because I'm open to that. In the Burton book, going back to the Burton book real quick, I talk about the possibility that Burton himself explored, those ancient tunnels that are suspected by some, believed by some to have been, made ages ago. So I am intrigued with this idea of a subterranean realm that is habitable, and people have been down there for a long time. I'm completely open to that possibility.
It's fascinating. I don't know what to make of it, but I just thought it was interesting, and I thought I'd throw it out there because it related. But I guess in closing, since we're kind of wrapping up here in terms of time, yeah, I guess in terms of your background, I wonder, like, in your perspective, does it feel to you that like the U.S. government is allowing, I guess, like the mainstream media outlets to sort of demonize law enforcement? Like, does it seem like that has been the case to you? And if so, why do you think that is? This is totally like an off subject thing, but I just think it might be a relative to kind of some of your experience, but there might be this notion in common, the zeitgeist, I guess, if you will, in terms of this.
I think that on this issue, primarily, it depends on which media source. Yes, there are mainstream media sources that do demonize law enforcement. Yes, there are media sources that exalt all law enforcement. When you've really been in law enforcement, you remind everybody that every law enforcement agency across this nation, every single one, small departments on up to big, have an internal affairs department. And the reason those exist isn't just to protect the policeman against unfair criticism. It's because there is corruption in the ranks of law enforcement. There is stupidity. There are guys and gals who decide to do the wrong thing under the authority of their badges. So, you know, from both sides, what you said is true. You can watch the media and see that, but it's the truth is that they're not all bad. In fact, again, as I said earlier, the beginning, coming full circle, most badge carriers, most of your law enforcement, those are good people who are trying to do it right and who do it right and you can trust. It's just like in society in general, it's always the few bad ones who ruin it for the rest of us, who make things tough and awful for the rest of us. But it makes it worse when, in our times especially, it seems like the baddies are in the highest levels and in the key positions to where they can get away with what they do, and they can just walk all over us.
Definitely. And I guess, I guess I'll ask one more question on your thoughts
Sure.
around that. And like, what are your thoughts on like the Epstein investigation? There's so many directions that we can go with that, but guys, like, I don't know, you can guys like
I,
Tom Hanks, he's on the list. And I guess it's interesting.
it's like that thing, the maneuvering and the machinations and the minutia that will be investigated of political opponents, okay, but yet no one on the Epstein list hasn't, the real one hasn't been listed. There's been no indictments. There's been no answering to what certain people were doing on the island. So yeah, I'm in that camp. It's ludicrous. It is absolutely ridiculous. And what it is the whole Epstein thing threatens people in power and
Yeah.
threatens them in a really bad way. I'm of the school of thought that I don't understand. Take Tom Hanks. He's probably one of the most famous names and faces that gets talked about on that list. It seems to me that if he was not involved with anything insidious or nefarious on that island and didn't witness it or whatever, it seems to me that he would have a long time ago wanted to have a press conference and say, folks, fans, loved ones, I had nothing to do with anything creepy, and
Right.
I saw nothing. And why he and the others haven't done that, yeah, you could argue that they say, well, ignore it and it'll go away. This ain't going away. And all it does is the silence increasingly makes people suspect, well, shoot, what did you do?
Yeah.
Did they compromise you?
And
What exactly is going on?
I guess he gave up his American citizenship and became like a Greek citizen or something along those lines. I don't know. It's very interesting though.
Is that a dual thing, or is it he just truly gave up American
Yeah,
citizenship?
I'm not exactly sure, but okay. I promise this is the last question.
Okay.
Do you know about Operation High Jump? A friend of mine, he's a lot older than me. He's interesting. Also, he was involved in like counterterrorism, although he mostly did like dignitary protection. He was like
Yeah, I did
like
a
an
little bit of
LT
that too.
trainer for like law enforcement or whatever. But
Yeah.
his mother was, I think, MI6 or MI5. I always get those
Cool.
confused. But
Okay.
British intel, and I've spoken to him before, and he's, I guess apparently she had firsthand knowledge or something about this Operation High Jump. So to your knowledge, is that is that currently like a still no fly zone? Like, what do you have? Any interesting insights into this whole situation with Operation High Jump? Does it relate to anything that you have
Oh
written
yeah.
about?
And stuff I've heard about. In fact, there's an excuse for me to come back and us have another conversation, because it would require a lengthier conversation. But I'll say this: there's a lot of nonsense and BS that gets bandied about Operation High Jump. When you look closely at it, you find that there's a lot of BS there. You find that Byrd was not really the effective commander. It was kind of an honorary thing. He was getting late in his career, and he was not, sadly, not taken very seriously. You find out that the guys who did die on the expedition, it was because they were flying a very treacherous route from New Zealand to Antarctica. And what you find is a very much more mundane set of facts. Okay. That said, oh, and his son, Richard Byrd Jr., was a naval officer on the expedition. And that's part of the that said part.
Okay.
There is still something we're not being told, okay, about that to this day, which makes no sense, because if it was Cold War related, that's been over for 30 years, right? So I think we're not looking, as Sala said in Raiders of the Lost Ark, they're digging in the wrong place. That's what we've been doing with this Byrd Antarctica thing. We're listening to all these nonsense stories, which are diversions. If you want to really find out what's going on with the Byrd thing in Antarctica, you got to start digging in the right place. Or as Russ Cole says in the first episode of True Detective, you got to start asking the right effing questions, detectives. And I think that's what's going on. So, yeah, there's something to it, but not what we've all been told and not what the popular mythology is.
Let's leave that to a potential future recording.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
All right, this was amazing. Is there any last messages or thoughts or anything in general? Anything you want to put
Well,
out there?
just let me do my shameless pitch.
Absolutely.
You can find me Sundays on my live stream at 3 p.m. Or thereabouts Pacific Standard Time at the Walter Bosley channel on YouTube, and you can find all my books at lulu.com, lulu.com. Now, a lot of them are on Amazon. You can find a bunch on Amazon. However, they still have to get processed through Lulu, even when you get them on Amazon. So you're still waiting 2 weeks for them. Just be aware of that. And my authors and I get more of our royalty if you get them directly from Lulu.
Get them on Lulu, everybody.
Yeah. So, yeah, there you go. And I have a website, lostcontinentlibrary.com, which is, you see the Lost Continent Library right there I'm pointing at, and also walterbosley.com. And these are being developed further each day. So you can find me.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. And
thank you.
I definitely encourage everybody to listen, and please go over and check out his website and his books because they're absolutely fascinating. So Walter, thank you so much again. Appreciate you. And until next time.
Thank you.